Rita Pierson is famously quoted as saying, "Every child deserves a champion, an adult who will never give up on them, who understands the power of connection and insists they become the best they can possibly be." This is so true of my guest on the show today.
Inspiration for Teachers podcast, bringing you dynamic and inspirational educator interviews. Our fascinating guests share their professional challenges and creative resolutions for success. Discover their workable strategies, ideas, and resources to reach your educational goals. And now your host, Kelly Long.
Leslie, welcome to the show. I'm so pleased that you've joined me today. I can't wait to get into your story and your challenge, because when I was reading it on the pre-interview notes, I actually got emotional about it because it's a really inspiring story. So I can't wait to dive into that and let our listeners experience it with us. But before we go there, please can you just give everybody some background as to who you are and what you specialise in, and then we'll take it forward and we'll take everybody on that journey with us.
I previously owned and operated a statewide tutoring company for children with learning differences for about 10 years, and then I became a mother of 3 children, 2 of which are autistic. And after the birth of my 3rd child, I helped co-author the book Emotional Mastery for Adults with Aspergers Syndrome. And then I co-created Autism Parenting Magazine from its inception until it had about over 14,000 Facebook followers, and I chose to leave the magazine business. And then I also, while all of that was going on, I also wrote my first children's book called Grace Figures Out School. Now I speak nationally about autism and different innovative special education techniques, and I'm currently working on building better summer programs for special education students.
Excellent, Leslie. Thank you so much for that. And then I always ask a question of my guests that they don't have any prior knowledge of to keep you on your toes. When it comes to giving homework, if you have special educational need, what is it about homework that you think is important?
I think what is important to keep in mind with homework is, why do we give homework in the first place? Now, we give homework to make sure the student understands the lesson they were taught during the day and to carry it on at night. What some of the children I've come across, I think the biggest hurdle is the amount of homework. They've already had to sit still and behave a certain way all day long in school. So then for them to come home, they need time to unwind. They usually are mentally and physically exhausted. And so for them to have to sit down and do more work is very, there's anxiety, it's maddening. So I think with students with special needs, at least the parents I've talked to, and in my own case, it takes a long time to convince them to even sit down and do it. There's more whining that goes into getting them to start than it does to actually do the task sometimes. So I think as an educator, you have to make sure that you give them 5 examples instead of 20. And as long as they're understanding it and they're doing it properly, then be okay with that. They still are participating. They still are expected to do some homework, but that they're not going to be overwhelmed by it and start hating school and education in general.
Just before we dive into the questions, can you give our listeners a bit more background in case they're not familiar with what autism is, and from a personal experience, what it is like raising 2 children with autism?
Autism is a neurological difference, and every person with it is affected differently. So for me, it's hard to lump it all into one category, but there are some that have difficulty speaking, and some people label them as nonverbal. Some people prefer to be labeled as non-speaking. My experience with parenting my 2 autistic children, I treat them the same way as I treat their sibling that is not autistic. They're my children. I love them. They have some challenges, and I help them with those challenges, or get them the help that they need to the best that I can. But I think the best thing I do is that I don't treat them differently. Although I do speak about autism and they do know that they are autistic, that I treat them the same way I would any other child, which means that I don't limit them. I give them every opportunity that I would any other child, even if people doubt that they can do it, because a lot of times I have found that the ability is there. They may need some assistance or some strategies to help them, but if they're interested in something, I want my children to have the opportunity to do whatever any other child would have the ability or the opportunity to do, rather. I have met a lot of parents that their child was tested for their cognitive ability, and the problem I have with that is that the testing is based on your ability to verbally speak and verbally communicate or use your hands. And a lot of children with autism that have trouble controlling their hands. And for me to believe the cognitive test is very difficult for me, because I've seen children with great, astounding cognitive abilities that were told that they only had the cognitive ability of a 3-year-old. So I think that we really need to find a better way to test those kids, because when parents hear your child will only have the cognitive ability of a 3-year-old, they believe that, and I think it has squashed the hopes of many parents, and they stop offering opportunities to their children, which is really sad. So I try to give my children all the opportunities that I would to any other child, and I've been very fortunate in the fact that my daughter was always highly verbal, but was physically delayed. She has hypotonia, which means she has difficulty gaining muscle, so her muscle strength is very weak. But because she was diagnosed with aspergers, she's extremely bright. She has sensory difficulties, which all people with autism have, which is when the information your body takes in through your senses is processed incorrectly, and they get very overwhelmed and need to take more frequent breaks. My son, on the other hand, he did, and he still does, struggle to speak. He can speak now. There are certain days that it's very difficult for his mouth to form the words that he's trying to say, and he can get very aggravated, and rightfully so, because it's so frustrating, because people rely on people to be able to communicate through verbally, and so heavily that you don't really notice it until it's taken away. I was fortunate, like I said, I found a way to communicate with my son. We started signing with him. After 2 months, he started to sign back.
Wow.
And I couldn't believe it. But it's difficult for him because just like his mouth doesn't always behave the way he wants it to, neither do his hands. And his hands will erratically, they'll flap, or they'll do this weird movement that he just can't control. But eventually he mastered a few signs, and once he mastered a sign, he would say the word that was associated with it. Once he mastered about 10 signs and those 10 words, he started to really be able to build his vocabulary and speak all the time.
That is really, really, I can't even put it into words. That is really difficult to try and communicate with your child. The isolating thing about it all is that people just assume and typecast, oh, your child's got this, so this is how we treat your child, but it's very isolating, if you don't know other people in that situation. And I guess I see it from a teaching point of view. If you haven't got experience of helping a child in that way, it must just feel like an uphill battle.
Even with all my experience, and I thought I knew so much, and I laugh now, I thought I knew a lot about autism, and then I had children, because just like reading any parenting book, you think, oh, when I have children, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and, my children are going to behave this way, and life is going to be perfect. And then life happens. We realize that, you can only control so much. even though signing works for my son, it does not work for all children that are autistic. And that's what I want people to know, is that every person with autism is as different as every other person in the world. Like, just because they have autism does not mean they're all the same. Yes, they may all have sensory issues, but even those sensory issues may be very different from the next person's sensory issues. It's a very complicated thing to understand. I'll be honest, it was very devastating when they first told me that my son was labeled at moderate to severe autism spectrum disorder. And I couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by that someone labeled my child severe, and how would everybody else in the world perceive that? Are they going to treat him differently because they think he can't communicate and that he never will? And I just refused to give up, because I could see that he could understand things. He just couldn't express himself. And because his hands wouldn't do what he wanted them to do frequently, he couldn't even point to something to let me know, I want that. So it became very difficult, but I'll never forget the day he was so frustrated. He was trying to tell me he wanted something. I could not figure out what it was. I was saying, do you want to go outside? Do you want a snack? Do you want, I was really trying, and he was so frustrated. He was crying and stomping his feet and just grunting because he couldn't talk then. And I just fell to the floor and started crying. And I said, I just don't know. I'm trying, but I don't know what you want. And I just sat there crying for a minute, and he ran into the living room and he grabbed this box of flashcards that I would always show him, that I thought he wasn't paying any attention to, but I just continued to show him anyway. And he dumped them all out all over the coffee table, and he wiped his hands back and forth, which splattered the flashcards all over the place. And I thought, oh, he must be having a meltdown. And he picked one up and held it up almost like to say, here, this is what I want. And he came over to me with it. And at that moment, I just knew he is in there. He is paying attention. He can communicate with me, and I shouldn't give up. And so it was then I started looking for ways, and there's actually a program called Speaking for Autism, or Speaking with Autism, or something like that. And her whole focus is to help nonverbal children with autism to sign. And she, as well as I, had the same experience where the children she has worked with, once they mastered the sign, they were able to say the word. Because when you sign it, you're also verbally saying it. Eventually, once they master the sign, they start saying the word, and they get rid of the signing. So it develops into a verbal communication. And like I said, it doesn't work for everyone. I have some friends that what's called rapid prompting method, RPM, which relies on using it's called a letter board, but it looks like a stencil board, and it has all the letters of the alphabet. And they use a multisensory approach where they tear a piece of paper and they talk, and they ask them 2 questions, and they can point to the answer. And people were amazed that after years of thinking their children had, like I said, the cognitive ability of a 3-year-old, they're finding out that these people, now in their teens, actually are quite brilliant, but had no way to communicate their brilliance or their abilities, whether it be musical or artistic or whatever, because somebody told them they only had the cognitive ability of a 3-year-old. Nobody offered them any other opportunities other than life skills. So we're going to teach them how to dress themselves, how to make themselves some food, but beyond that, they stopped educating them. And so a lot of these people had taught themselves how to read and write and do arithmetic. And so I think the thing I learned as a parent, not from the educator side of things, but I've learned from the parental side of things, is that you can't believe what other people tell you. You just have to hope for the best, and you never stop hoping.
I think that's really poignant, and I think it's also very true, because we get training on autism and aspergers, dyslexia, and everything to a certain extent gets put into a box, and it's very much like, this is what this person would be like, and therefore you do this. But we're just really impacting on the surface. I mean, there are institutions out there that really specialize in, as you said, severe cases. But a lot of children, they do have all of these difficulties, and it's very hard to help them in that situation where, you've got such insider knowledge, you know to keep trying, and, maybe it didn't work this way, but maybe you need to work that way. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to say, well, we're not just going to say this person can't do it. We're just going to try these different strategies and these different approaches because this person is intelligent, and not limit what they can achieve.
What is it that excites you most right now about education?
There have been many changes over the year here in the U.S. as far as special education goes. When I was growing up, the special education students were in one small classroom that was usually the size of a closet down the hall. Nobody ever saw them. Nobody ever communicated with them. On occasion, you might see them in the lunchroom over in the corner with the other special education students, but there was no involvement. There was no interfering with them at all. And I always found that very sad. And now we have all of these laws, so we have inclusion, so we have to include all of these students in everything that we would any other student, which I think is fantastic. And so we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and under that there is LRE, which stands for Least Restrictive Environment, which means we have to include these children in the least restrictive way. So I love that we have to. The one downside of all of these laws is that they're usually very vague. So what is acceptable is always debatable, really. What is least restrictive? What is least restrictive to one person may be very restrictive to another. So a lot of it is really left up to the individual school district. So in the past, April of 2014, one of the district courts defined that least restrictive environment must be made available not only during the regular school year, which is September through June, but also during ESY, which is the extended school year, during the summer months. And this really threw a lot of teachers and school districts into a panic because not all of them were including kids, the special education children, during the summer months. They were separated from the general education students. So I started working on a program to incorporate all of the children during the summer. Very simple program that schools can incorporate on a very low budget with what they already have to incorporate the special education students with the general ed students and still be able to meet all of the individualized tasks that they have to meet for all of the students. So the program was initially started, I started formulating it for just students with Asperger's because I felt like they were being left out of a lot of different programs. So they were either sending them out of town on the town's dime with a personal paraprofessional, which got very costly, or they were putting them in summer school with the students that needed academic help, which a lot of the Asperger's students don't need academic help. They're actually usually quite advanced academically, but they need to be working on their social skills, especially I think during the summer, because social skills are so important. And I've heard some teachers will try to argue with me why the schools should even bother teaching social skills that were there for academics. And I have to disagree. And I explained to them that, I might have been able to see that before I was a parent, but now that I am, I really see how if a child is having anxiety because of the social difficulties they're experiencing in school, then when they go to school, their anxiety can kind of overrun their thinking process, and then they're not able to focus on their academics. So if we're able to teach them some simple social skills or coping strategies, then and they don't have to worry about making friends or being, or fearing certain people, or then they're able to just go to school and learn and focus on learning.
Everybody comes through the school system, and they are very much now the centre of community. It's not just that we're teaching about our subjects and that we're passionate about our subjects, so we want to inspire them and make them passionate about it. It's everything else. We have to consider, what's going on in their home environment, what's going on with the child, how they're socially interacting when they're at school. So we're covering the whole spectrum of society when people are coming through the education system. So to just say that we're here to teach, I think it's much bigger than that now. And I don't think we can just say as educators, that's what we're here to do. I think we have a bigger job to fulfill. And I think sometimes that's when people coming into the profession or how stakeholders view education, I think that communication is a bit skewed.
Yes, I agree that it's so important. I think our role as educators has evolved, and we are not just there to teach academics, we're there to set them up for life. And part of those life skills is being able to communicate well with other people, and for those people to learn to accept that some people don't communicate the same way. And so I think that if we're able to explain that to children growing up, that they'll understand that there's a variety of people, and that's okay that everybody's different, and how to accept those differences, and how to really enjoy everybody's strengths. Everybody is different. Everybody has a weakness. Everybody has a strength. And if we can just really draw on everyone's strengths, we could really, really build everybody's confidence up and set them up for good job skills later in life.
So if we were to turn around to you now and to ask, what would you recommend as being, the top strategies for social skills to teach to these children? What would be your advice? I don't want to kind of gloss over it and say, oh yes, this one strategy works for everybody.
I think a good portion of students with autism, especially in general, that if you can help the anxiety, then you can then work on social skills. What I've found is that a lot of people have even the children, that have such bad anxiety that it then creates barriers for them to even learn social skills. And I strongly oppose forcing children to make eye contact. Even for myself, I find it very difficult to maintain eye contact with someone. I end up wondering, am I looking at the right eye? Am I looking too intensely? And then I'm not thinking about the conversation or what they're saying. It ends up just being about the eye contact. So I always try to tell people, educators, to not become obsessed with eye contact, that there are several other things you can help with. Teaching things that are, usually people with autism are very black and white thinkers. It's either right or wrong, yes or no. Well, if you incorporate that kind of thinking when you're teaching social skills, then I think it becomes much easier. The things you need to be careful about are, because they are black and white learners, you need to keep in mind that if you tell them this behavior is wrong, they will label children that have ever treated them that way as wrong or as bad. And we don't want that.
I can resonate with that because I had a boy in my class. He was very much the same, very black and white. And I remember him turning around to me one day and he said, "Miss, that lipstick you're wearing does not suit your face." And I said, "You are probably right.
And
Maybe I shouldn't wear it."
They honestly do not mean you any harm. They think they're being helpful.
It was probably very true. It was probably a bit too bright. But those social cues, they don't pick up on. But I just took it in good heart. But it must be a really awkward world to move through if you do see everything in black and white, especially get through the education system where it's not black and white and there are so many rules and those rules aren't always enforced in the same way. What might work for one teacher doesn't work for another teacher, so it must be really confusing.
Yes, it is. It's very confusing.
Leslie, let's move on to your professional challenge and the reason why you are joining us on the show today. So could you just give us a bit of background about what happened?
Yes. A mother contacted me and asked me if I would help her son with a traumatic brain injury. And I was new to traumatic brain injury, and I told her, I'm not really sure that I can help you. And she said, I disagree. She said, I think that you think outside the box, and that's exactly what my son needs. So I said, okay, well, tell me more about your son and about the situation. And so she told me that he was ice skating one day and was hit in the head with a bow and arrow. There was hunters nearby, and the bow and arrow was shot in the wrong direction, and it went out of the woods and over onto the ice pond and shot him in the head. Now, they were very lucky to save his life. And brain injuries are the most complex, I think, of any disability from an educational standpoint, because the brain is so complex. I mean, even we've had years of studying neurology and the brain, and we're still so confused about so many things. But he had been developing normally until he had been hit in the head, and he had to relearn how to walk and talk, how to eat, how to do everything all over again. I believe he was 10 years old when he was hit. By the time his mother had called me, he was walking and talking, and he was doing quite well. The problem they had was the educational team at his school had been working with him for 6 years and was able to get him to read. He could not even retain the alphabet, which obviously you need to know the letters and the sounds of the alphabet to be able to form a word. You can't sound out a word if you don't know the sounds of the letters or phonics in general. So for 6 years they had tried, and they couldn't get him to retain anything. They would think that he really grasped a concept, and then he would go home, and the next day it was all gone. It was as if, she said, that when he went to sleep, everything reset. So I started working with him, and at first we just did some basic things so I could really get a feel for how he worked. And we did just some basic work in a workbook. And then I added more manipulative, so his hands were working with his mind, more of a kinesthetic approach to things. We started with stickers in the workbook, and then we would add more physical activity, like bouncing a ball as we sounded out the letters, things like that. And some of it started to stick, but not a lot. And so I started to think, education isn't just a job to me, it's my passion. And I've always been very passionate about finding a way to reach each student. It occurred to me one night, one of my professors had said something about how the best time to study is right before bed, because it's as if the brain exercises that last bit of information all night long for you as you're sleeping. So it's really building it in there for you, hammering it away, helping you retain that last bit of information. And so I couldn't help but think, I wonder if the last things he hears as he falls asleep is the lessons that we are working on, if it would stick better. So I asked his mother's permission, of course, if we could record on cassette back then his tutoring lessons, and if she would play them for him as he fell asleep. And so she did. And so there would be a lesson, and then we would read a simple story, and it was all on the cassette. And he would listen to this right before bed and as he fell asleep.
Within 6 months,
he had learned the alphabet, the sounds of the alphabet, and was reading.
Wow. How on earth did he do that?
It was quite a miracle. And we became quite good friends. What we need to take away from it is that we need to think about what we're not taught as educators. Okay? We need to think about everything we learn and how we can make this specific student a better student based on what we learned. What helped him wasn't what I learned in college. What helped him was me being able to think in a different way, to be able to reach how his brain happened to be working.
I think this is often the problem, that we're very much focused on the end goal, which is in all, education systems, it's that final test. But I think that then narrows our ability to be creative. But if we step away from it and think creatively about the individual and how they learn, amazing things like what you've just told us can happen. I mean, that's just, like you said, that's just a miracle. I'm gobsmacked at that.
I know. I think what we get stuck at as teachers is we get a program and we think we have to follow the program to the T.
Even from the point of view that you could use that strategy just to record your revision notes at night and play them before you go to, even in its simplest form, that's quite a powerful strategy.
It really is. I mean, if you do a search, there are scientific studies that recommend studying at bedtime is really the best. So
maybe I might do it every night before I go to bed, because there's so much I need to remember.
And now, Leslie, let's hit the inspiration round.
Can you share with us the best advice you've ever received?
I think the best advice I ever received was not from an educator, but from my father, who I think is quite a brilliant man. He taught me this phrase, and he still says it today: man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. And I think that's very true, and it's become a problem, I think, in school, because we teach everyone the same way, we expect them all to learn the same way, we expect everybody to think the same way, and the problem I have with that is that if I thought the same way as everyone else, then I wouldn't have helped as many children as I have. Yes, we want children to learn, and there are certain things you all do need to learn. We still all need to learn how to add and subtract and divide and multiply. We still all need to learn how to read, but I think getting there is not what matters. I think there are so many times in schools that teachers get caught up in how the student got to that point. Does it really matter how they got the right answer, or does it matter that they got the right answer? There's so many teachers that will take points off for not showing your work. And if you punish someone for just knowing the answer, they will eventually get frustrated with education and start to do poorly. They will not want to go to school, and they will stop trying because they're not doing it the way you want. And if you punish them for not doing it your way, no one is going to win.
This one should be quite easy for you, because we've talked about so many of them through this episode. But what is your proudest moment?
I think that's a difficult one for me. Definitely the case I explained with the traumatic brain injured student. There's also, I've worked with several children that were adopted from Russia. The public schools wouldn't take them until they knew enough English. So there was one case where the family they had adopted a daughter, and she was having a bit of a difficulty getting adjusted here in America, and they found out that she had siblings. So they went and they tried to adopt one of her siblings that they found. They were told that he had very low cognitive ability or intellectual ability, and that when he turned 18 that he was going to be sent to a mental ward for the rest of his life because he was intellectually disabled. Thankfully, the family adopted him anyway. And I think it was very close to his 18th birthday. It was like a week before his 18th birthday. And he came over here and knew not a word of English. And I knew right away that he had no intellectual disability at all. He was brilliant. They told the family that he was intellectually disabled because he couldn't read. He couldn't read because no one had ever taught him, because there were no books and no one to teach him. Again, he was another student that just had so much motivation. He was so thankful to be given a chance at life. He was about to be locked away for the rest of his life because he couldn't read, simply because no one ever taught him. Him and my student with the traumatic brain injury, they were my two greatest academic educationally related achievements.
Wow, Leslie, you have got so many powerful stories. I'm just in complete awe of you because the challenges that you've faced, it's just like, oh my gosh, every time you come up against one of these challenges, you must just have to start from scratch all over again. And although you've got all that experience you can draw upon, it must just be like, here we go, fresh case, different set of scenarios, and then you're just going to start with creating something to help them to get where they need to be. It's just like, wow.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I love the challenge, I really want to solve it. I mean, there are times that it's very trying, it's very stressful, because there are times when I feel like I'm their only hope. And I get a lot of cases like that when people come to me because they have no one else that will even attempt to try. I think that's why I really don't like cognitive testing. I mean, not that it's all wrong. I think that we need to find other ways to test, because I've found so many situations, like I've explained, that, the testing was wrong. And all it took was just one person to believe that they could. And I think we can really help a lot of kids that were just tested wrong.
I was talking to Ellie Shever, and she was talking from the other side, from dyslexic point of view, and she was saying the same thing, that people get tested, they get categorized, and then that's it. Thinking and playing to everybody's strength is what's more important, the desire to learn, and I think that's what focus gets distorted sometimes.
Absolutely. There are so many famous dyslexics, especially, in America, there's many famous dyslexic actors and actresses. Yeah, reading may have been difficult for them, but they are so creative, and so, they have so many other fantastic traits. And I think that's with everybody. Everyone has something that they're not great at, and I think it's ridiculous that we expect everyone to be fantastic and get straight A's in every topic and every subject. That's just not how we're wired. Usually it's natural if you're great in English and reading, that you're not fantastic at math. Or if you're great in math, you're not fantastic at English and reading. It's always been that way, and that's just how the brain happens to work usually. So it's very rare that you find someone that is great in both. So I think if we stop expecting everyone to be perfect at everything, that one, we would alleviate a lot of the pressure and anxiety that we're causing everyone, and two, we would all be happier, because we'd be able to say, I'm an expert at this, I'm great at this, instead of, yeah, I had straight A's in everything, and now what do I do? Because
exactly,
you get through high school, and then you're almost like, well, now what do I do? Because I was great at all of those subjects, but now I have no one point to work towards.
Wouldn't it be an interesting world if everybody followed their passion from a young age? So let's move on to your sources of inspiration.
I remember being in high school, and actually it was probably even before that. I was in, I believe, the 7th grade. I won every award that there was to win. And there was only one other girl who won almost as many awards as I did. And both of her parents were teachers, and she was an only child, so they worked with her very, very frequently. Both of them were there to see her get those awards. And my parents were not there, not that they didn't care, but that my parents had to work. I remember my mother bought me a plant. And she told me that, she couldn't make too big of a deal out of it because, learning came easy to me, but it didn't come easy to my brother and my sister. And I had honestly not even noticed how difficult it was for my brother and my sister until she said that to me. And when it came to high school, my sister became so frustrated with trying to learn that she ended up dropping out of high school. And I couldn't help but wonder why she couldn't learn as easily as I could. And now my parents traveled a lot when I was in school, and they would go to conferences, and they would pull my brother and I out of school, and we would go to these conferences with them. We would stay in the hotel, and we would be expected to do our schoolwork while they were at the conference. And it was actually quite a wonderful upbringing, because we would, if we had completed all of our schoolwork poolside, usually in a hotel, that when they were done with their conference, my father had always planned these great trips where we would learn about history in person, and he would take us to the Washington Monument and teach us about Lincoln and teach us about all of these great things in person, which learning it from a book and experiencing it in person are two very different things. We were very grateful to learn those things. But what I learned was that I was able to teach myself. You know, I would get the makeup work and do it all myself without a problem. I would read it, understand it, and do it. And my brother and my sister really struggled to do that. I started becoming a bit obsessed about the brain and how it worked and how people learned. And then I learned about learning disabilities. And I believe my brother and my sister have, you know, learning disabilities that back then nobody really knew about or paid very much attention to unless it was really brought to their attention. So I became a bit obsessed about learning and the brain and psychology. So I was really studying neurology, psychology, and education in high school. After school, I would go to the bookstore and I would just read everything I could get my hands on to figure out a way to help my brother, because he was younger and I didn't want him to drop out of high school. And it did come to a point where they almost didn't let him get his diploma. I took it upon myself, and after school I would take him to the bookstore and I would help him, and he ended up graduating, and I was very, very, very proud of him. And, you know, because of my siblings, I didn't want anyone else to fall through the cracks. You know, I wanted to be able to find a way, because they are very smart in their own ways. You know, there are so many things that my sister is fantastic at. She can remember numbers, anything mathematical from, you know, years ago. She can remember the old address we lived at, the old phone numbers we've had. She can remember anything numerical, and I can't. So to me, that's a gift, you know, that she can do that. And to her, she's jealous that I can read these, you know, I could understand Shakespeare and by the 8th grade at a very deep level that was just probably not normal. So, so to her, that was my strength, and she was so envious of that. So I think that all of those really inspired me to become an educator.
Honestly, I just love asking the next question because I just can't wait to hear what you're going to say to us. Okay, so a teaching habit that you could share.
Even as students get older, I always say you have to keep it fun, and the more fun, the better. People, this is also a scientific thing too. The more fun people have, when adrenaline is pumping through your body, you have a tendency to remember those experiences more than any other. So if you get your kids so excited about something, then they have a tendency to retain the information better, okay? And to me, retention is everything, because if you don't remember it, then you technically haven't learned it, you know? And there are so many instances where I can learn something and master it, and I can take the test, and by next week, I will not remember anything I had taken on that test. So retention is important. If you get them out of their seats and active and having fun, you know, I just feel like your brain works better when you're moving, and at least mine does. So even if you have a school where you can't let the students get out of their seats, maybe I had, you know, one of those small stress balls once that I would, you know, throw to the students, and we'd call it popcorn, or we'd call it ball hop, or I forget. They all came up with their own name, and to keep it fun, to keep them involved, I let them feel like they created the game. So they would all have to read at least one sentence, and then you would say pop, and they would have to toss the ball to someone else, and whoever caught the ball, they would have to read at least one more sentence. They could read up to one paragraph, but they would have to read at least one sentence. Now, this helps because for students that it's very difficult to read out loud, that was a very stressful event for them. But now they know that at the most you only have to read one sentence, and then you can throw the ball. Now, that's fun to kids. Now, it has to be a very soft ball, and they have to say pop and give everyone a chance to look up. I mean, there were rules, but there were many, so now there's many aspects to that, okay? Now they're following rules, they're following directions, they're having fun, they're using their hands, they're thinking about others, and they're reading. Simple strategies that can make just learning fun is really, I guess, my bit of advice.
I've got a interesting one that I do with my kids, but just because I love playing the game, and I always make them play not musical chairs, but we play musical corners. So, I mean, and I'm in a computer room as well, so it's very much, the rules are laid down, not too much running around. There are computers in here. It has to be safe. They love it. The music starts playing. Their dancing is just weird, but they do this crazy dancing, and then they go and find a corner, and they're all standing there, and they're all just on tenterhooks wanting to know who the number is going to fall on to be asked a question, and they love it. And every time the number falls on somebody, they've always got the answer, because they're all thinking, oh, is it going to be me? Is it going to be me? Is it going to be me? So they're already engaged and they're thinking, and they love it, and everybody can play that game.
I was speaking to a bunch of teachers, and again, I wrote another blog about this that got a lot of attention because my daughter came home one day and said that they were going to take away recess if she didn't finish her coloring in her picture. Now, they have to write a story and color in the picture. Now, I understand that if your student doesn't finish their work because they're joking around, that, there needs to be some sort of consequence. The problem I have is that we have dwindled down the little amount of time that they actually have to play or to be out of their seat. Now, it's just not normal to sit still for that amount of time as a child. And from, I think it's like they go to school from like 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Like, that's a long time to expect children to sit still and pay attention. And so, again, I pulled all of these studies, and it's been proven that the more recess time that they have given these students, the better the students did academically. There was, I believe it was in Finland, they had 2 or 3 recesses, okay? And when they did have to sit down and learn, they were ready to learn because they had gotten out all of that energy, and they were able to calm their mind and focus. Learn it faster and retain it longer. And isn't that what we want? We want them to learn it faster and retain it longer. And I'm not saying we should all have recess, 5 times a day, but I am saying that we do need to allow them to get up and expel that energy, or they're not going to focus. It doesn't matter how well you're good of a teacher you are. If they can't focus in their mind, they're not going to learn it.
Leslie, before we say goodbye, please can you recommend a resource and a platform to contact you on?
Well, I guess I would have to say my blog, which really delves into a lot of the stories that we're talking about now and points people to different resources that I found that have been helpful. Really my blog is the best place to point people because you can do a search and you can search for what specifically related to education you're looking for. The blog also has pointers for parents to how they can help them with special education.
I've really, really appreciated your time today, Leslie. I've learned so much, so thank you so much for that.
I want to say thank you so much for having me, Kelly.
You have inspired me, and everything that you do, I'm just like, wow, I feel really, really small in comparison.
Oh, no. I'm glad that you have this show. I think it's wonderful, and I was listening to one of the podcasts and how one of the teachers said standardized testing is getting a bit out of hand, and I couldn't agree with him more. And I said, when someone asks me, what's the number one thing you want to change in education? I think a lot of people think the testing, we're teaching to the test, and are we actually teaching the students what they need to know, the basics? So, sometimes we get lost in all the mandates that are put on us as educators.
Thank you for joining us today on Inspiration for Teachers. For more resources, tips, and advice, visit our website, inspirationforteachers.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, we would love to connect with you. Just click like on our Facebook page at facebook.com/inspirationforteachers.